A final letter concealed in the shadows for years, now the FBI has unearthed it. But what leaves everyone utterly stunned isn't merely the words on that aged paper but the chilling truth lurking behind each character. Why did this letter vanish mysteriously after the tragedy? Who sought to ensure it was never discovered? And most importantly, what within it compels the FBI to reopen the investigation immediately? Chapter 1, The Masked Routine, A Final Farewell. Betsy Arakawa, the devoted wife of cinematic legend Gene Hackman, was always known for her composure and elegant demeanor. Before the tragic events unfolded, no one could have imagined she harbored a deep-seated sorrow. Her final days, as captured by security cameras and daily interactions, reveal a poignant narrative of resilience and affection. On February 9, 2025, Betsy was last seen collecting her beloved dog Xena from the veterinary clinic. Security footage shows her exiting with a gentle smile, caressing Xena with tender affection. There were no indications of her experiencing any distress or anxiety. She wore a light blue jacket, jeans, and comfortable sneakers, reflecting her understated yet refined style. 2 days later, on February 11, Betsy continued her routine. She visited the local farmer's market, where she often purchased fresh produce for her family. A vendor recalls, she was always amiable and knew exactly what she wanted. That day, she bought some apples, greens, and a bouquet of sunflowers. Afterward, Betsy stopped by the CVS pharmacy for personal items. Security footage shows her pausing at the cosmetics counter, examining several skincare products before proceeding to the checkout. Her final stop of the day was the pet store. Betsy was always meticulous about the diets of Xena and her 2 other dogs. She spent time discussing new food options suitable for Xena with the staff. A store employee shared, Mrs. Betsy was very concerned about her dog's well-being. She wanted to ensure they received the best nutrition. Despite Betsy's seemingly normal demeanor, those close to her noticed subtle changes in her behavior. Her massage therapist, who had worked with Betsy for over a decade, received an email from her on the evening of February 11. In the email, Betsy wrote, "I've been feeling a bit fatigued lately. Perhaps we should postpone this week's appointment. I'll reach out when I feel better." This was the first time Betsy had canceled an appointment without a specific reason. The massage therapist recalls, she always prioritized her well-being. The sudden cancellation concerned me, but I thought she might just need some rest. Betsy's friends also noted her unusual silence. A close friend shared, "We frequently texted and called each other, but that week, I didn't receive any responses. I thought she might be occupied or needed some solitude." This silence, though minor, signaled to those who knew Betsy that something was amiss. Gene Hackman, at 95, was battling late-stage Alzheimer's disease. Betsy, his life partner and primary caregiver, dedicated all her time and energy to his care. A neighbor recounted, Betsy rarely ventured out for long. She was always concerned about Gene and wanted to be by his side constantly. The burden of caring for a seriously ill loved one can cause immense emotional strain, no matter how strong the caregiver. Betsy never complained about her responsibilities. She always appeared resilient and optimistic. However, those close to her knew she was under significant pressure. A family friend shared, Betsy loved Gene deeply. She was willing to sacrifice everything for him, but we worried she wasn't taking adequate care of herself. After February 11, Betsy was no longer seen in any public places. Calls and messages from friends and family went unanswered. A neighbor living near their home recalled, "We thought they might have gone on vacation or wanted some privacy. No one suspected anything was wrong." The sudden disappearance of Betsy and Gene left numerous questions unanswered. Betsy's daily activities beforehand showed no signs of abnormality. She continued to shop, care for her pets, and attend to her well-being. Yet behind her smile and composure, she may have been concealing an anguish that no one could perceive. Chapter 2, The Silent Home, Days of Unnoticed Death. As night fell on February 11, the outside world continued its course, but inside the quiet home of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, time seemed to stand still. No one knew that from that moment on, a silent tragedy was unfolding, unnoticed by anyone. Gene Hackman's home was located in a quiet suburb of Santa Fe, New Mexico, where there were no blaring car horns or bustling crowds. It was an ideal place for him to enjoy his twilight years after leaving Hollywood. But it was also here, in the days that followed, that became a sealed space where no one outside could know what was happening inside. With late-stage Alzheimer's disease, Gene Hackman no longer had a clear awareness of time or even the events around him. At times, he might forget his loved ones, confuse memories, or live in fragments of the past that his mind replayed. But did he realize that Betsy was no longer by his side? Did he understand that she had left him forever, right in their own home? When Betsy passed away on February 11, no one knew what had happened inside that house. The most terrifying thing was that Hackman might have lived for several more days in that very house without realizing his wife's permanent absence. Each morning, he probably still went to the kitchen, seeking breakfast as a routine, but there was no one to prepare his coffee, no one to call his name with a familiar voice. Each afternoon, he might sit in his familiar armchair, looking out at the yard where Betsy used to tend the garden, but there was no one to water the plants, no one to tell him about the little things of the day. Each evening, Hackman might enter the bedroom, looking towards the bed and thinking his wife was somewhere in the house. But in reality, she had been lying there for days, unknown to him. Normally, if Betsy didn't contact anyone for a few days, her friends would feel concerned. But knowing that she was dedicating all her time to caring for Gene, no one thought to check immediately. Moreover, their home always had a quiet atmosphere. Betsy preferred to maintain absolute privacy for her husband. She had little contact with neighbors, avoided the media, and only communicated with a few close friends. So when she didn't reply to messages or calls for a few days, no one suspected anything unusual. No one suspected that during that time, Gene Hackman might have been walking around the house, living with someone who had passed away, without realizing it. Alzheimer's not only takes away memory but also makes it impossible for the patient to distinguish between reality and fragments of memory. It's possible that in the days after Betsy's passing, Gene Hackman still thought she was somewhere in the house. Perhaps he thought Betsy was in the bedroom, so he didn't go in to check. Perhaps he believed she was out shopping, so he didn't feel worried. Or perhaps, in his mind, Betsy was always there, right beside him, like the beautiful days of the past. No one knew exactly how long Hackman lived like that. But the fact was, he didn't alert anyone. He didn't call. Relatives didn't seek help. There was no sign that he was aware of this loss. As the days passed, the house showed no signs of life. No one came in or out. No orders were placed for delivery. No calls were made. Sunlight shone through the windows, quietly illuminating the room where Betsy used to sit and read. But no one turned the pages of those books anymore. Cold evenings enveloped the house, but no one turned on the fireplace. No one knew how Gene Hackman experienced those days, but one thing was certain, he lived with that loss unknowingly. Chapter 3, The Suicide Note, A Cry Lost in Time. The silence that enveloped Gene Hackman's home was finally broken when investigators entered. They discovered not only a mystery buried in long, lonely days but also something that made everything even more heartbreaking, a suspected suicide note from Betsy Arakawa. A letter. A message. A sorrow abandoned by time. When the FBI investigated the final days of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, they didn't expect to find a suicide note. But there it was, buried among old documents, perhaps forgotten, or perhaps it was never meant to be sent. The letter was short, but each line was filled with emotion. It wasn't exactly a simple farewell, but more like a record of lonely, exhausted, and hopeless months. Betsy Arakawa, the woman who had been by Gene Hackman's side for nearly 4 decades, had spent her final days caring for her husband with late-stage Alzheimer's. Day by day, she watched the man who had once been strong, who had stood at the pinnacle of Hollywood, gradually lose himself. And Betsy herself was drawn into that vortex. The letter began with a painful confession, "I am tired. I don't know if I can do this anymore." No one had ever seen Betsy complain about caring for Gene Hackman, but these lines revealed a truth she had never told anyone: she felt exhausted. Alzheimer's didn't just take Gene Hackman away, it took her life away too. She lost herself while carrying everything alone, with no one beside her to share the burden. She had no escape, unable to return to the past but also unable to let go of the man she loved. There was a particularly haunting passage in the letter: "Every day I look into his eyes and wonder if he still sees me. Sometimes he does. Sometimes he doesn't. But I see him slipping away, and there is nothing I can do." The words cut like a knife, a love that had lasted decades, but now only one side was trying to hold on while the other was slipping into darkness. And then, the last line of the letter left everyone stunned: "I don't want to leave him, but I don't know how to stay." A paradoxical statement, but one that perfectly reflected the despair Betsy was experiencing. When the FBI released this letter, public opinion exploded. Had Betsy Arakawa decided to end her life, or was this just an emotional outpouring from a woman on the verge of collapse? Close friends said that Betsy showed no signs of being suicidal before her death. She was still shopping, emailing her massage therapist, and doing her daily routines. If she really planned to leave this world, why would she continue these habits? On the other hand, some psychologists argued that the letter didn't necessarily have to be a clear plan. Sometimes, people in deep pain simply write down their thoughts, not necessarily to take any action. However, one thing was clear: Betsy Arakawa felt desperately lonely, and that made the whole story even more tragic. Another big question was raised: did Gene Hackman ever read this letter? With late-stage Alzheimer's, it was highly likely that he never saw it. If the letter was written in Betsy's final months, she might have hidden it, not wanting to trouble him. But there was another hypothesis: Hackman might have held the letter but then forgotten its contents. A moment of clarity, only to fall into oblivion immediately after. If that were true, this tragedy would be even more painful. Betsy Arakawa's suicide note was not just a farewell, but a cry for help lost in time. It was the final confession of a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for her husband, only to be trapped in her own sacrifice. It was a letter that never reached the person who needed to read it. Because even if Gene Hackman held it, he probably wasn't lucid enough to understand its meaning. It was a heartbreaking story of love, sacrifice, and utter loneliness. When the FBI found this letter, it had probably been there for many days, weeks, or even months, a testament to sadness, loss, and what could not be salvaged. Now, only the big question remained: was this letter a warning sign that no one noticed in time? Or was it simply the final confession of a woman who had endured too much? Whatever the answer, the truth remained: Betsy Arakawa was gone, leaving Gene Hackman alone in a world he could no longer fully perceive. Chapter 4, H-Virus, the hidden killer or a convenient explanation. The passing of Betsy Arakawa, which seemed to have reached its conclusion with the haunting suicide note, took a shocking turn, pushing the FBI's investigation in an entirely new direction. When the forensic report was released, it revealed a startling truth. Betsy Arakawa's body showed traces of H-virus, a dangerous virus transmitted by rodents. The immediate questions were: how could a person living in a luxurious, well-protected mansion contract a virus that primarily appears in wilderness areas or unsanitary environments? Was this a tragic coincidence, or was there an unseen hand behind it? The FBI had reason to suspect. Was Betsy Arakawa's death truly natural, or was this an explanation too perfect to conceal something else? H-virus is not a common disease, but when a person is infected, the mortality rate can reach up to 38%. According to the forensic report, Betsy Arakawa's body showed signs of acute respiratory distress, high fever, and organ damage, typical symptoms of H-virus. She might have contracted the virus several days before her death, and during that time, her condition might have deteriorated beyond saving. However, what was unusual was that Betsy had no history of going to high-risk areas. There were no reports of rodent infestations in her residential area. Gene Hackman, despite living in the same house, was completely unaffected by the virus. A link was missing in this story, and that was what made the FBI start questioning. When a person dies under unusual circumstances, the FBI typically considers all possibilities. Did she contract the virus from her surroundings? But that was unlikely, as her living area had high sanitation standards. Did someone intentionally cause her death? If so, who had the motive? Or was this simply a terrifying coincidence? Whatever the answer, one truth was undeniable: this disease had silently ravaged Betsy's body before anyone realized what was happening. As soon as the H-virus information was released, the FBI launched an immediate investigation. Several hypotheses were quickly put forward. Did someone intentionally introduce the virus into Betsy's home? If so, how did they do it? Did she accidentally come into contact with the virus while out? But security cameras didn't record any trips to high-risk areas. Could Gene Hackman have accidentally brought the virus home? But if so, why wasn't he infected? The FBI inspected Gene Hackman's entire house but found no signs of rodents or other vermin. This raised an even more frightening question: where did the virus come from? In mysterious cases, sometimes a simple answer is a sign of something much more complex. Betsy Arakawa's death from Hiru seemed like a medically plausible explanation, but circumstantially it was too perfect to be true. Some forensic experts questioned: was the virus truly the primary cause of death or just a contributing factor? Did someone take advantage of this disease to hide something? Were the suicide note and the disease related? The FBI had not yet issued an official conclusion, but it was clear that this was not a simple case. Throughout this story, there was a significant but tragic factor: Gene Hackman might have been completely unaware of what was happening. With late-stage Alzheimer's, he might not have realized that his wife was seriously ill. He might have seen her weaken day by day but couldn't understand that she was facing a deadly disease. Even when Betsy passed away, he might not have realized that she had left forever. If Gene Hackman had been lucid, he might have helped the FBI find crucial clues. But in his current state, he was just an unwilling witness, trapped in a storm he couldn't understand. In the end, Betsy Arakawa's death left too many mysteries. Where did she really contract Hirus? Was this a crime or just a tragic accident? Did someone take advantage of this disease to hide something bigger? The FBI continued to investigate, but one thing was certain: Betsy Arakawa's passing was not as simple as it seemed. And the most important question remained unanswered: would Gene Hackman ever understand what happened to the woman he loved most? Chapter 5, 2 Bodies, 1 Mystery, The Eerie Discovery. 15 days. 15 days in a vast, luxurious mansion, completely isolated from the outside world. No one came in or out. No calls were answered. No one knew what was happening inside. It wasn't until a foul odor began to spread that a maintenance worker was sent to check the plumbing. And he was the first to discover one of the most haunting scenes in Hollywood history. 2 bodies. 1 mystery. A terrifying story had just been revealed. When the maintenance worker arrived at Gene Hackman's mansion, he had no idea he was about to step into a haunting scene. The front door wasn't locked, just ajar. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of disturbance. But the pervasive silence sent a chill down his spine. As soon as he entered, a pungent stench hit him, forcing him to cover his mouth and nose, the smell of decomposition. He walked into the living room and immediately froze. There, Gene Hackman sat in a chair, his head slightly bowed, sunglasses still on his face, his hands resting on his cane. At first, he thought Gene Hackman was asleep. But then, realizing the absolute stillness, he knew something was wrong. Gene Hackman had departed this world. But the most terrifying part was yet to come. Overcoming the shock of seeing Hackman deceased, the maintenance worker continued into the mansion, following the direction of the pungent odor. The bathroom door was wide open. On the cold marble floor, Betsy Arakawa lay motionless. Pills were scattered everywhere. She wore a white silk robe, her long black hair spread out, her eyes closed. There were no signs of violence, no signs of struggle, just an eerie stillness. In the corner of the room, a small dog lay dead, its body curled up, its eyes wide open, as if it had experienced extreme panic before passing away. Strangely, 2 other dogs were still alive but in a state of terror, trembling, huddled in a corner like silent witnesses to a horrific tragedy. The anomalies were quickly noted. Gene Hackman passed away in the living room, in a chair, with no signs of struggle. Betsy Arakawa lay in the bathroom, surrounded by scattered pills. 1 dog was dead, while 2 others were alive but in a state of extreme panic. What had really happened in this mansion? Police and the FBI quickly got involved. 3 main hypotheses were put forward. Hypothesis 1, Hackman passed away first, and Betsy took her own life out of unbearable loneliness. Gene Hackman was elderly and had late-stage Alzheimer's. He could have passed away from natural causes. Betsy could have discovered he was gone but, in her grief, decided to end her life. The dog's death could have been due to psychological shock or infection. But this hypothesis had a major flaw. Why was Betsy in the bathroom with pills scattered everywhere? And why were there traces of Hirus in her body? Hypothesis 2, both were infected with Hirus, a slow and cruel death. The forensic report confirmed that Betsy was infected with the virus. The virus could have spread to Gene Hackman, causing both to gradually weaken and pass away. But if that were the case, why was Hackman sitting upright in his chair, as if waiting for something? And why was only 1 dog dead, while the other 2 were alive? Hypothesis 3, a murder covered up. The FBI didn't rule out the possibility of outside interference. Did someone introduce Hirus into the house? Did someone arrange these deaths to look like a natural tragedy? The dead dog might have been evidence, killed to hide something. The biggest question remained unanswered: who had the motive? And if this was indeed a murder, what was the most important clue? Had Hackman been completely unaware of what was happening around him? Had Betsy tried to leave a clue, but it was too late? Or had someone erased all traces, turning this place into a perfect scene of a family tragedy? 2 people, together for over 30 years. A love that seemed eternal, but ended in a tragedy no one could understand. The FBI continued to investigate, but all clues seemed to lead to a dead end. The question remained: was this a painful coincidence or an unsolved crime? Would the truth ever be revealed, or would it be forever buried in that luxurious mansion, where 2 people who loved each other disappeared from this world?